Okay, so now that we've had a chance to finish up with some of these secondary wrinkles on the rhino's body, let's now start to turn our attention to adding a little bit of detail to the horn. Okay, so here's the rhino's skin detail that we were able to add in the previous lesson. So right now, up to this point, we really have not focused too much on this horn area and adding a little bit of surface detail to these areas. So let's go ahead and take care of that. I'm going to contain the detail for this rhino's horn on its own layer. So let's go to a new layer, make a new one. Okay, and let's rename this. Alright, and we'll rename this something like horn detail. Okay, so in a previous lesson we had masked off this area of the horn. If you haven't already done that, that can be done by just pressing and holding the Control key on your keyboard and then just painting away. If you want to be able to unmask any areas, it's going to be Control and Alt at the same time to unmask any areas. Okay, so let's go ahead and mask this area off of the horn if you haven't done so already. So we want the entire horn area to be nice and separated. So let's go ahead and just isolate these areas and just focus on the horn. Alright, so now that's isolated, I'm going to go ahead and just collapse this menu on the side. And if we want to, rather than remasking everything around this face area, right, because everything that's masked is not going to be affected, so what we could do is just simply inverse this mask instead. So if we press and hold the Control key and just click once anywhere out in this open space, that will invert the mask. And now we can paint on these horns without having to accidentally worry about deselecting anything. Yep, so let me undo that. Let me go ahead and just unmask this little spot right there. There we are. Right, so let's come in and add a little bit of detail to this horn area. Let's pick a new alpha. Let's see what we have. We have something like that. That's not quite what I'm looking for. Let's grab this one over here, alpha number 8. Okay, let's switch to a nice large brush size. And let's see what we can do about maybe just dragging some of these areas out a little bit more. Alright, so we'll start to get just a little bit of bumpiness and a little bit of repetitive pattern on here. And these could be things like dirt, debris, a little bit of noisiness. Let's add some along this back horn as well. Just enough to kind of rough up the shape a little bit more so it's not quite so perfect in its overall shape. You can come in, just add a few of these little noise spots. Okay. We could probably come in with a little bit of this colored spray and sort of get a similar effect with this brush. So we randomize that placement a little bit more instead of having to come in and manually place each one of these little dots. Okay, and we won't worry too much about the overall shape. We'll talk a little bit later about how we can come in and make some little better modifications once we actually come in and start to paint in the color. So I'll switch back to a normal flat alpha. Let's add a little bit of Z addition. And what I'll try to do is very, very subtly try to come in and just alter up the shape of this horn. Just enough to where it's not quite so perfect and artificial looking. So just add a little bit of differentiation to some of these little horned areas. A few lumps here, a few bumps there. There we go. You can see how that now looks a little bit more like something that you would see in nature. Not quite so perfect and artificial looking. Alright, and as I mentioned, we'll come back and add a little bit more detail to this once we actually start to get into the texturing process. So let me inverse this mask. Let me switch back to my drag rectangle. And let's use this alpha number 25. All right, and I'll go ahead and just make sure that this is all masked off around this horn area. And we use this number 25 alpha just to add a little bit more dirt and debris types of effects around the base of the horn. Let's maybe bump that up a little bit more. That may be a little bit too much. So we can start to come in and add some of these variations around the base, where you would probably expect to see a little bit of dirt and debris, mud, things like that that start to accumulate in some of these areas. There we go. So starting to bring that type of effect around. We'll carry a little bit up to the front. There we go. Maybe a little bit lower Z intensity for some of these back areas, just to tone this overall effect down a little bit more. And don't forget this, since we have this on its own layer, we could actually just take the layer's intensity down if we decide that overall this debris is just becoming too much. We could start to lower its overall height in order to get that effect. Okay, so let's go ahead and unmask that, and you can start to see now what we wind up with. Alright, very nice. Just starting to work a little bit more toward that natural look and getting away from the artificiality that unfortunately is kind of the standard look whenever you're doing a lot of this sculpting to start out with. Okay, so I might carry a few of these little dirt and debris areas up to the base of the horn itself, just so we don't have quite such an abrupt stop in this debris and some of these types of effects. Just carrying a little bit more of that up and around. As I mentioned, we'll come back and revisit these areas a little bit more once we get a little bit into the texturing phase. Look at how we can paint texture in addition to coming in and also painting some displacement at the same time. Alright. So we'll go ahead and call that good for now. Let me go ahead and reveal the rest of my geometry. Alright. Now before I wrap this up, this particular lesson, there's a few of these areas around the overall body, some of these areas around the shoulder, around the rump, where it's a little bit flat looking, and where you have that much muscle and that much tissue with that much gravity pulling down on it, it's probably not going to be quite this flat and smooth as we can see in this shoulder area. So let's come in and very quickly just add a little bit of variation to this. So we'll use a very, very low Z intensity and also a very large brush. Let's back this down even a little bit more. And just very quickly come in and make a few of these strokes. Let's maybe bump that back up a little bit more. So we can come in, pull some of these areas up. I'll press and hold on my Alt key and push a few of these areas down, just enough to add a little bit of variation in some of the height of this tissue. Okay, so we'll carry this a little bit up. Maybe start to add a few of these lumps around the underbelly, where we'll definitely have some gravity in some of this loose tissue that's going to be sagging a little bit more. So again, just adding some of these little variations. So we'll carry some of that around. And you can see why I'm using a very large brush with a very low intensity, because a little bit of this goes a long way, and we really don't want to get away from this nice natural look that we're starting to achieve and accidentally wind up ruining that with some of these very straight looking brush strokes that we're starting to make. So very low intensity. You can run over an area several times if you want to be able to very gradually start to bulge some of these areas up. Now around this rump, when we were actually modeling this back in XSI for one of our previous training kits, we actually did already work in some of this variation in this back area, so we probably won't have to do a whole lot to this particular section. I'll press and hold my Alt key and push some of these areas in, and maybe work out some of this rump a little bit more. Start to round out some of these areas. There we go. Maybe start to pull out a little bit more of this tissue around the leg crease. There we go. So now this just isn't quite so perfect as far as the overall look goes. We'll add just a very, very slight amount of variation in some of these muscles. And just finish off this illusion that this is a real creature. Maybe start to pull out some of these wrinkles down here a little bit more. Building some of these areas out. Okay. So overall, I'm really happy where this is going. This is starting to look very, very nice, very natural looking, and starting to get away from some of that CG look that we initially started out with, where everything was really nice and smooth and perfect looking. Okay. So to go ahead and stop at this point. And what we'll start to do now that we have a lot of the detailing on this finished up is we'll start to now turn our attention to some of the coloring and the texturing of this Rhino. All right, so we'll start to work on that particular process starting in the next lesson.